Before we begin, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following is for educational and entertainment purposes only. What transpired on the 19th day of the federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs shook not only the courtroom in the Southern District of New York, but the entire justice system. It began like any other morning. The air outside the courthouse was thick with anticipation as reporters gathered near the barricades, their notebooks in hand and cameras trained on the marble steps. Inside, the atmosphere was taut but routine. The legal teams arranged their exhibits, jurors filed into their box, and Judge Raymond Delaney entered with the calm assurance of a man who had presided over hundreds of high-profile cases. Diddy Combs, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit with his trademark diamond lapel pin, sat at the defense table flanked by 6 attorneys, his expression unreadable. The court officer announced the start of the session, and the clerk began calling the morning's scheduled witnesses. Then, something unexpected happened. Assistant U.S. Attorney Caroline Bennett stood and respectfully requested the court's permission to introduce an unscheduled witness due to an urgent matter. Her tone was not frantic, but carried enough gravity to shift the energy in the room. Judge Delaney paused for a moment, his expression neutral, then granted her request. As the doors at the rear of the courtroom opened, a woman stepped in FBI Special Agent Catherine Morales, a 20-year veteran known for her precision and cold resolve. She walked to the witness stand carrying a sealed black portfolio and an evidence box. The room fell silent. Jurors leaned forward. Reporters stopped typing. Something was about to happen. After being sworn in, Morales distributed sealed folders to the judge, defense, and court reporter. "Your Honor," she began, "during our ongoing investigation related to the defendant, we have uncovered substantial evidence of an attempt to compromise the integrity of this trial." There was a ripple in the room. Diddy Combs shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers tapping a rhythm on the table. "Specifically," Morales continued, "we have reason to believe that there has been an organized and deliberate attempt to influence the outcome of this trial through bribery, intimidation, and the exploitation of personal vulnerabilities among jury members." Judge Delaney opened the folder before him and his face tightened. Across the room, Diddy Combs' lead attorney leaned in, whispering rapidly to his client, but Diddy Combs waved him off, eyes fixed on Morales. What followed was 47 minutes of testimony that would later be described as historic. Morales outlined a scheme involving up to 7 jurors, each approached by intermediaries offering financial incentives ranging from $150,000 to $3 million, tailored specifically to their individual financial profiles. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency wallets were all employed to conceal the origin of the bribes. But the evidence didn't stop there. Morales produced surveillance footage of Diddy Combs' business manager exchanging documents with a known fixer. She played audio recordings obtained from within the detention center calls made on contraband phones, conversations in coded language, each tracing back to the defendant. The courtroom, which had seen no shortage of dramatic moments since the trial began, now stood frozen. Diddy Combs' face remained still, but his right leg bounced under the table. His attorneys scribbled furiously, a particular excerpt from a call sent chills through the room. "15 is nothing. If it buys my freedom, make it 20. Just make sure it's clean." When that recording ended, Diddy Combs' hand slammed onto the table with a sharp crack, startling the court officers. Judge Delaney, usually a model of restraint, removed his glasses, exhaled, and looked directly at the defendant. The judge's voice was calm but low with authority. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have never witnessed such a flagrant attempt to subvert justice." The room was now a pressure cooker. Court reporters struggled to keep pace, jurors sat stunned, and for the first time since his indictment, Diddy Combs' confidence appeared fractured. But Morales wasn't finished. She described how the FBI first uncovered the bribery attempt 3 days prior, when juror number 8, a 42-year-old accountant, approached court security to report that a stranger had confronted her in the parking garage of her apartment. The man knew her children's names, where her husband worked, and what kind of car she drove. He wasn't threatening, she said. He called it insurance proof that he could help her see the case clearly. He offered her $2 million via a consulting contract if the trial produced a correct outcome. The FBI immediately placed her under protection and launched a covert surveillance operation. Within 24 hours, they intercepted similar contact attempts with juror number 5 and juror number 11. The patterns were the same: personal information, gentle persuasion, and large sums of money. What truly stunned the court was the level of sophistication. Each juror had been profiled in depth. Financial histories, medical records, and even therapy notes had been accessed data that should have been impossible to retrieve. Judge Delaney, visibly disturbed, leaned forward as Morales presented a flowchart showing how $15 million had moved through a labyrinth of offshore accounts, all leading back to Diddy Combs' production companies. One particular moment shifted the atmosphere completely. A series of still photos were displayed. Diddy Combs' top lieutenant, seated in a restaurant booth with a man identified as the fixer, exchanging a thick envelope. The envelope, later recovered, contained dossiers on 3 jurors. The final blow came when Morales revealed that Diddy Combs had spoken on tape about backup plans if the bribery failed. "Have the second set of players on standby. No names, only codes." When she finished her testimony, there was a moment of eerie silence, broken only by the sound of Judge Delaney adjusting his microphone. "We are going to take a brief recess," he announced, his tone tighter than usual. "The jury will return to their chambers. Counsel will remain in this building. No one is to leave." The bailiff moved quickly. As jurors were escorted out, Diddy Combs leaned over to whisper to his attorney, but Judge Delaney cut through the room like a blade. "Mr. Combs, I will remind you, you are still under the authority of this court." Diddy Combs sat back slowly. The man who had entered the room that morning with a confident smirk now looked down at the table, his jaw clenched, his diamond pin gleaming like a cruel irony. Outside the courthouse, news of the day's events began to leak. Reporters scrambled, phones buzzed, live streams fired up. The headlines would soon read, "Bribery, Bombshell Shakes Diddy Combs Trial." But inside, the storm was only beginning. As the courtroom emptied for recess, those who remained behind knew they had just witnessed the beginning of a collapse, not just of a defense strategy, but of an empire carefully constructed over decades. And it had all unraveled in less than an hour. The man who once ruled music charts, red carpets, and billion-dollar deals had now been reduced to a defendant watching his fortress of influence crumble brick by brick under the weight of justice. The look in his eyes as court officers flanked him, as the judge left the bench, and as the media waited outside, was not one of defiance. It was the stunned, haunted look of a man who had spent years believing he was untouchable until the system finally reached up and touched back. Judge Raymond Delaney returned to the bench with an expression that no longer sought to conceal the weight of what he had absorbed. His usual posture of measured detachment had been replaced by something heavier, as if the robe he wore now carried the burden of a system wounded by betrayal. When he spoke, the courtroom was not simply quiet, it was reverent, the silence of a cathedral during confession. "I've been a federal judge for 29 years," he began, his voice deliberate but resonant. "I've overseen trials involving organized crime families, domestic terrorism, and international fraud. But I have never encountered an effort to undermine judicial integrity as audacious, calculated, and corrosive as what has been presented today." His gaze moved to Diddy, who sat stiffly, his lawyers whispering around him but no longer guiding him. "Mr. Combs," the judge continued, "let me speak to you plainly. The evidence presented does not suggest, it demonstrates with disturbing clarity that you authorized, funded, and directed a conspiracy to corrupt the core of this process. The right to a fair trial by an impartial jury is not just a legal technicality. It is the foundation of every protection we offer in this country. And you tried to poison it. Not through passion or panic, but through spreadsheets, wire transfers, and hired mouths." He paused, taking a moment to glance at the thick files now resting on his bench like tombstones. The folders Morales had brought, their edges bent from repeated handling, contained more than numbers. They contained intent, planning, malice shaped into contracts. The judge continued. "I am dismissing the current jury effective immediately. They will receive the court's full protection and gratitude. You tried to break them, but they stood firm. That alone speaks volumes about the difference between who you are and who they are. A new jury will be impaneled under revised security protocols. And make no mistake, the prosecution is hereby granted permission to present evidence of your tampering to this new jury. Let it serve as proof not just of consciousness of guilt, but of a pattern of contempt for this court and its institutions." Diddy inhaled sharply at this but said nothing. He was listening now, truly listening, perhaps for the first time since his indictment. The judge leaned forward slightly, his tone sharpening. "Let me be perfectly clear. You are now facing additional charges: jury tampering, obstruction of justice, and criminal conspiracy. These are not enhancements. These are independent felonies, each with serious consequences. Should you be convicted, I will treat your attempt to undermine this court as a significant aggravating factor in sentencing. The guidelines give me considerable discretion, and I am prepared to exercise every inch of it." The defense rose to object, citing Diddy rights, mental health, and the presumption of innocence. Judge Delaney listened in silence, then raised his hand. "Counsel, let me stop you there. Your client has had every benefit the system could offer, every procedural courtesy, every legal accommodation. What he has not had is respect for the court, for the rule of law, or for the people he tried to buy. And now he will have consequences. Effective immediately, I am revoking all special accommodations. The defendant will no longer receive visits beyond his legal team. All communications will be monitored. He will be housed under maximum security conditions." The judge's words struck with a finality that even the sharpest legal minds in the room could not deflect. And then came the moment that would replay on news programs and legal commentary shows for weeks to come. Diddy stood up. His hands gripped the table. His voice, once silk-smooth and confident, cracked slightly as he shouted, "This is a setup. You've been out to get me from day one. This entire trial is a sham." "Sit down, Mr. Combs," Judge Delaney ordered. But Diddy didn't. Instead, he pointed a trembling finger toward the bench. You think you can tear me down? I built this empire. I've created jobs, fed families. You don't know what I've done for people." The courtroom was frozen. Court officers stepped forward, ready to restrain him. One of his attorneys tugged at his sleeve, hissing, "Sit down now, Sean." But the judge did not raise his voice. He simply said, "Mr. Combs, if you do not comply immediately, I will hold you in contempt and authorize your removal from this courtroom." Diddy Combs stared for a beat longer, his chest heaving, then slowly sat down. But the damage had been done, not to the court, to himself. Judge Delaney straightened the stack of papers before him, then turned to the prosecution. "Given the developments, does the government wish to make any motions at this time?" Assistant U.S. Attorney Bennett rose smoothly. "Yes, Your Honor. In light of the overwhelming evidence of jury tampering and the defendant's continued risk to these proceedings, we move to revoke bail entirely and request that Mr. Combs be placed in solitary confinement." The defense erupted, citing constitutional protections, mental health evaluations, due process. But their arguments were no longer cutting through the room. They bounced off walls that had already absorbed too much. The judge's decision came quickly. Motion granted. Effective immediately, the defendant will be remanded to solitary confinement. His communications will be restricted to verified meetings with attorneys of record. Any and all accommodations previously afforded are revoked. The courtroom murmured, a rising tide of disbelief. But no one stood in objection anymore. The performance was over. The system had responded. As officers moved to escort Diddy Combs, his lawyers tried to delay to speak with him one last time. But he waved them off. His face was pale now, his jaw slack. It was the look of a man no longer on stage but in a cage, the bars no longer metaphorical. Before the court adjourned for the day, Judge Delaney requested that the courtroom be cleared press, spectators, even junior staff. Only the core personnel remained. For 90 minutes, behind closed doors, something happened that few outside would ever fully understand. But when the doors reopened, Diddy Combs returned looking different. Deflated, yes, but not defeated. Humbled, perhaps, or calculating. When court resumed, Judge Delaney addressed the room. The record will reflect that during the closed session, Mr. Combs agreed to cooperate with the prosecution and provide information about the full scope of the jury tampering operation. This cooperation, if verified, will be taken into consideration during sentencing. The words landed like thunder, not just on the court, on the public, on the media, on the industry, on every associate, every partner, every rival who had once feared him. The man who never broke had just bent. And as the judge ordered a 1-week recess to allow both sides to process the new development, the message was clear. The game had changed. Forever. Diddy Combs sat in silence as he was led from the courtroom. He did not look at his attorneys. He did not look at the judge. But just before he exited, he turned toward the gallery, now empty, and seemed to search for something that was no longer there. Control, certainty, or perhaps just the illusion of invincibility. And in that moment, the man, once larger than life, looked for the first time entirely human. The holding cell where Diddy Combs now sat was nothing like the luxury lounges he had once used to negotiate record deals, nor the private jets where he had brokered branding empires at 30,000 feet. It was cold, clinical, and indifferent to his past. The walls did not care about his platinum albums, and the dim fluorescent light above did not recognize his face. There was no music here, no entourage, no glass of champagne balanced on the edge of ego. Just a steel bench, a toilet, and silence thick enough to suffocate. Yet, it was in this silence that Diddy made his decision. Not out of remorse, not because of a moral reckoning, but because he understood that silence was now more dangerous than speaking. Within 24 hours of his private cooperation session with Judge Delaney, a ripple ran through the federal system. The prosecutors moved quickly, issuing subpoenas, freezing additional accounts, and quietly reaching out to names that had until now been whispers in sealed folders. Morales returned to court with new files and a new directive to dismantle what had once been deemed untouchable. During her testimony, she outlined a layered structure of operations built with a corporate strategist's mind and a criminal's boldness. What we uncovered, she said, is a system designed to survive without its creator. It had redundancies, backups, and automated triggers that allowed it to operate even with Diddy in custody. There were code phrases hidden in innocuous business calls like "Advance the Miami Project" or "Greenlight the Lego Studio," which activated hidden financial networks. Messages passed through family members who never knew they were relaying anything. One niece received an envelope with concert tickets and a handwritten note. The tickets were scanned, and the QR codes embedded inside led to a digital wallet ID used in laundering payments to a juror. Another associate was instructed to deliver a birthday gift to a family friend in Atlanta. The box contained chocolates, but one was hollowed out and held a micro SD card containing lists of vulnerabilities for jurors based on illegally obtained data. The court watched in stunned silence as images of spreadsheets appeared on the monitor, showing columns labeled Juror ID, Financial Pressure Points, Custody Disputes, and Preferred Contact Method. It was not only the act of tampering that shocked, but the clinical way in which it had been executed. This wasn't desperation. This was design. Morales presented financial records that traced payments through 17 shell corporations across 4 countries in 5 currencies. One transfer originated in a nightclub earnings report, moved through a sports endorsement subsidiary, and landed in a fake agricultural NGO in Belize. From there, it was converted to crypto, funneled through a dark wallet, and eventually reached a consulting contract in a juror's cousin's name. The complexity was breathtaking, and it all pointed back to a single architect. But what disturbed the court most was that this wasn't new. Morales pulled up sealed testimony from previous cases connected to Diddy associates. In 3 separate incidents over the last 10 years, witnesses had either recanted, disappeared, or encountered unexpected hardships that rendered their participation impossible. In one case, a key witness in a civil suit filed by a former assistant lost their job days before their court date. Another, a woman involved in a tax fraud investigation, had her medical bills mysteriously paid off, after which she stopped cooperating. While we cannot conclusively tie these events to Mr. Comey's, Morales stated, the patterns of intimidation and reward are strikingly consistent. As this evidence was laid bare, Diddy sat stone-faced. Gone was the defiant energy of the earlier weeks. He no longer whispered to his attorneys or scanned the room for allies. He simply stared ahead, blinking less frequently, his hands clasped tightly together as if holding on to the last semblance of structure in a collapsing house. Judge Delaney listened without interruption, his questions to Morales precise and surgical. When you say this operation was designed to continue in his absence, what do you mean? Morales answered calmly. It had protocols based on contingencies. If he was detained, certain operatives would receive coded messages to activate sequences. If one node failed, another would compensate. In effect, the system anticipated loss of access and adapted in real time. The courtroom was still. Even veteran legal commentators in the back rows had stopped typing. No one had seen anything like this. When the prosecution asked to introduce photographic evidence of a remote meeting in upstate New York between Diddy Combs' financial advisor and a man identified as a digital laundering expert, the defense finally objected. They argued that the photos were obtained without proper warrant. But Judge Delaney denied the motion. The national security implications of this operation justify the court's emergency warrant approval. We will not suppress the truth in the name of procedural technicality. That statement echoed beyond the courtroom, picked up by networks and debated by legal analysts. And it was only the beginning. The next morning, the Department of Justice issued a formal statement confirming that they had opened a parallel investigation into potential long-term criminal enterprise activities connected to Diddy Combs' entertainment conglomerate. Subpoenas were issued to past employees, former security contractors, digital infrastructure providers, and even social media platforms suspected of being used to coordinate coded communication. Meanwhile, the public response spiraled. Influencers who once hailed Diddy Comb as an icon now deleted posts. Brand partners issued vague but strategic announcements about ongoing reviews. Streaming platforms temporarily delisted content, citing policy reviews. And behind the scenes, calls were being made by frightened collaborators, many of whom now faced potential charges. The domino effect had begun. But inside the courthouse, the drama turned inward. Diddy Combs' own team was fragmenting. One junior associate agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. A longtime driver admitted that he had once delivered sealed envelopes to unidentified recipients on orders that came from a second assistant through encrypted email. And then came the leak. A segment of a prison phone call between Diddy Comb and an unknown party was anonymously sent to a major news network. In the call, Diddy Comb said, "If they're going to play hardball, so will I. There's people they don't want named. I name them. Everything burns." The clip aired within hours. It confirmed what many had suspected, that Diddy Combs' cooperation wasn't a surrender. It was leverage. Judge Delaney addressed the matter the following day in court. "While this court has no confirmation of the leak's origin," he said, "let me be clear. Any attempt to weaponize cooperation as a form of blackmail will be viewed as obstruction. Mr. Commies, you are not in a negotiation. You are in custody. You are facing the full force of a justice system you tried to corrupt. You may provide truthful testimony. You may offer names, evidence, details. But if you attempt to manipulate that cooperation, the court will not hesitate to impose maximum consequences." The eyes of the room returned to Diddy Comb. He nodded slightly, but whether in agreement or calculation, no one could say. By the end of the week, 4 additional individuals had been taken into custody. 2 shell company operators, a crypto wallet engineer, and a private security agent accused of facilitating surveillance on jurors. More than a dozen others received target letters, a sign that the prosecution was expanding the case into a full-fledged RICO investigation. The walls were closing in. And yet, the man at the center of it all sat quietly behind bulletproof glass in a private holding chamber. When asked by his lawyer whether he still wanted to go through with cooperation, he replied without emotion, "The only way out is through." But he wasn't smiling anymore. The final week of the trial began with the courthouse surrounded by double the usual number of federal marshals, satellite vans parked in permanent formation along the perimeter, and a line of journalists that wrapped around the block like a pilgrimage to the collapse of power. Inside, the air felt heavier, as if each hour carried more gravity than the last. The judge, the prosecution, the defense all walked into that courtroom with the sense that the end was no longer abstract. It had form, it had sound, and its weight fell squarely on the man now shackled in a reinforced holding chair at the defense table. Diddy no longer wore custom suits or silk ties. He had been issued a regulation khaki jumpsuit with his last name stenciled in block letters over his heart. The diamond he once wore on his lapel had been replaced by a plastic ID tag, clipped sideways by a guard who no longer feared his gaze. He did not look around the room anymore. His eyes no longer searched for cameras or fans. He sat forward, but not with intensity. More like someone bracing for impact. The prosecution called its final set of witnesses 3 former Inner Circle associates who had accepted plea deals in exchange for full disclosure. One was a digital systems consultant who admitted to constructing encrypted financial tracking platforms used to reroute payments. Another, a former executive assistant, detailed the internal fire code system Diddy used to escalate communications from prison through lawyers and family proxies. The third witness brought the room to a hush. It was the fixer the man photographed in upstate New York receiving the dossiers. His testimony was slow, deliberate, and devastating. He detailed the exact steps used to approach jurors, how he was recruited, paid, and instructed. He identified voice messages and recordings by tone and phrase. He repeated the instructions given to him. Don't ask for yes. Just ask for understanding. Plant the thought. Water it. Then walk away. When asked why he came forward, he looked down and answered, "Because I realized the empire wasn't worth the weight of my soul." The courtroom remained silent long after he stepped down. Even the defense didn't attempt a cross-examination. By then, the strategy had changed. There was no longer any denial, only damage control. Judge Delaney recessed court for the afternoon and returned with a brief statement. The prosecution had concluded its presentation. The defense, citing strategic consideration and the overwhelming volume of evidence, had chosen not to call any witnesses. Closing arguments would begin the next morning. That night, the country held its breath. News anchors framed the case not just as the fall of a mogul, but the moment America watched influence dissolve under the pressure of justice. Podcasts dissected every line of testimony. Hashtags trended globally. In one viral post, someone wrote, "He built a kingdom and mistook fear for loyalty. Turns out the system doesn't kneel forever." The next morning, court resumed. The prosecution's closing argument was surgical and sobering. They did not rely on theatrics or character assassination. They simply walked the jury through the timeline, the evidence, the voices, the money. The assistant U.S. attorney finished with this: "Justice is not about punishing power. It's about protecting the powerless from those who believe they can buy silence. No one is above the law, not even a man with a private jet and a platinum record, especially not him." The defense, reduced to a shadow of the team that had entered the courtroom weeks earlier with swagger, spoke briefly. They asked the jury to consider that cooperation might signify change, that even a man of great power, when faced with undeniable consequence, could choose to help rather than harm. It was a soft appeal, a whisper against a tide. The jury deliberated for 2 days. During that time, Diddy remained in isolation. He was allowed no television, no outside contact beyond daily briefings from his attorney. His meals arrived through a slot. The only sounds were the buzz of electric locks and the shuffling of guards. When the verdict came, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, court watchers, off-duty lawyers, even retired judges filled the benches. Judge Delaney entered in silence. The jury returned in formation. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with an expression carved from deliberation, stood with the paper in her hand, on the charge of jury tampering guilty, on the charge of obstruction of justice guilty, on the charge of conspiracy guilty, on the original charges of racketeering, wire fraud, and aggravated witness intimidation guilty. 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 Diddy blinked twice. He did not cry. He did not collapse. But those watching closely saw something deeper. Not shock, not protest, it was vacancy. The absence of power, of certainty, of the armor he had worn for decades. Judge Delaney thanked the jury for their service and ordered protections extended to them indefinitely. Then he turned to the defendant. "Mr. Combs, please rise." Diddy stood. The judge's voice was deliberate. "You were once regarded as a symbol of success, of reinvention, of power cultivated through vision. But you weaponized that power. You used it not to uplift, but to corrupt, to conceal, to control. In this court's judgment, you have not only broken the law, you have broken the public trust." He paused. "You will be sentenced to 37 years in federal custody without the possibility of parole. This sentence reflects the magnitude of your actions and your attempt to subvert the very institution that allowed you to face trial. It also reflects the need to send a message that justice, while sometimes slow, is not blind to money, fame, or fear." The sentence landed not just on Diddy but across a nation watching live. The courtroom exploded into a storm of flashes, gasps, and scribbling pens. But amid it all, Diddy stood still, as if waiting to wake up from a nightmare he had once called a strategy. When court officers approached to escort him away, he did not resist. He turned only once, just briefly, to look at the seal of the United States behind the judge's bench. The final door closed behind him with a mechanical hiss. The sound echoed longer than it should have. In the weeks that followed, his empire fractured. Companies restructured, boards resigned. Collaborators issued statements laced with denial and selective memory. But the public had moved on. The culture had absorbed the lesson. And Judge Delaney's words had become more than court record. They had become doctrine. In a rare interview, weeks later, the judge offered only one sentence when asked if he believed the verdict had real impact. He said, "Power means nothing when the people holding it believe they are above consequence." And that, more than any headline, was the final line in the story of Diddy